An entire family vanished from their home in 1987, leaving behind everything they owned. But 7 years later, investigators made a discovery in a hidden room that left everyone horrified. In the small suburban neighborhood of Lakewood, Colorado, October afternoons typically brought the scent of burning leaves and the sound of children racing home from school buses. The White family home on Maple Street, with its neatly trimmed lawn and white picket fence, blended perfectly with this picturesque American dream. But in the basement of that ordinary house, Robert White hunched over his amateur radio equipment, his thick mustache, which he often joked was compensation for impending baldness, twitching with concentration as he adjusted dials and scribbled frequency numbers in his notebook. 7.35 megahertz. There it is again, he muttered to himself, pressing the headphones tighter against his ears. His fingers, precise from years of engineering work at Martin Marietta, jotted down a series of numbers that made sense only to him. Upstairs in the kitchen, Sarah White arranged worksheets for her third-grade math class, her golden blonde hair pulled back in its characteristic casual ponytail. Through the doorway, she could see her 8-year-old son Michael sprawled on the living room carpet, Nintendo controller in hand, his Colorado Rockies striped shirt, the one he refused to take off even for bed, riding up to expose his small back as he leaned forward intensely. "Mom, I'm on level 4-2, Michael called out without taking his eyes off the screen. "That's wonderful, sweetie," Sarah replied with the automatic enthusiasm of a mother who'd heard similar announcements 100 times before. "Dinner in 20 minutes, though. Dad should be up from the basement by then." 2 days later, at Thursday afternoon baseball practice, Coach Peterson noticed something odd about Robert White. The typically attentive father kept checking his wristwatch and muttering to himself along the sidelines instead of cheering for Michael's pitching attempts. "Everything okay, Rob?" the coach asked during a water break. Robert startled slightly. "What? Oh yes, just work stuff, something about radio frequencies." His eyes darted around the field as if looking for invisible listeners. He mumbled something about radio frequencies, Coach Peterson would later tell investigators. Seemed completely distracted, not like himself at all. That evening, the White family sat in their usual booth at Denny's, their monthly tradition. Judy Simmons, their regular waitress, noticed the familiar scene. Michael enthusiastically describing a new Nintendo game he wanted, Sarah promising to consider it if his grades stayed up, and Robert was different this time. He barely touched his grand slam, Judy would later recall, kept looking out the window, checking his watch. When I asked if everything was okay with the food, he just nodded without really hearing me. On Friday afternoon, Sarah taught her math class as usual, mentioning to a colleague that she planned to reorganize the basement over the weekend. Robert left work early, something his co-workers found unusual for the dedicated engineer. He'd been agitated these past weeks, Dave Mathers from Martin Marietta would later testify. Always talking about his radio equipment and how he'd picked up something important. "We thought it was just hobby excitement, you know?" At 3:20 that afternoon, Michael White was last seen jumping off the school bus, his Transformers backpack bouncing against his Colorado Rockies shirt as he raced toward home. Saturday morning brought the first sign that something was wrong. Frank Dellinger, the neighborhood milkman for 23 years, noticed the previous day's milk bottles still sitting untouched on the Whites' porch. "Never happened before," he commented to Dorothy Evans next door. "The Whites are clockwork people, especially Sarah." By noon, when Dorothy noticed no movement and the newspaper still on the driveway, she used the spare key Sarah had entrusted to her for plant emergencies and entered the silent house. What she found disturbed her precisely because of its mundane interruption. The television still on, broadcasting Saturday morning cartoons. Plates with half-eaten dinner on the dining table. 3 partially consumed glasses of milk. Robert's wallet on the kitchen counter. Sarah's car keys hanging in their usual spot. Michael's Nintendo still connected to the living room TV. Super Mario Bros. Paused on level 4-2. The family's blue 1985 Chevrolet Impala sat in the garage. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no evidence of hasty packing. It's like they simply vanished mid-routine, Officer Peter Ramirez would write in his initial report after Dorothy's trembling call to the Jefferson County Police Department. As the first month without the Whites concluded, Margaret Collins organized a vigil at First Baptist Church. Holding up the last photo of Michael, taken on his 8th birthday just 2 months prior, she fought back tears. "My grandson should be playing his Nintendo, not missing without explanation." While Lakewood prepared for Christmas, Margaret Collins, now staying permanently with a friend to remain close to the investigation, hung 3 stockings on the fireplace, one for Sarah, one for Robert, and a small one with Michael's name embroidered on it. "They'll come back," she insisted, though her eyes revealed a deep pain that contradicted her hopeful words. The anonymous call came in at midnight, the voice deliberately muffled, yet oddly precise. "You're looking in the wrong place. The answer isn't where they went, but what Robert was listening to on his radio in the weeks before." Detective Carlos Rodriguez sat at his desk 3 months later, dark circles under his eyes, as he played the recording for the 20th time, while snow fell silently outside the station window. Something about the caller's certainty haunted him. The White case file had grown thick with dead ends and speculation, but the radio angle remained largely unexplored. The following afternoon, Rodriguez found himself in the basement of the Lakewood Public Library, surrounded by 12 enthusiastic men ranging from their 30s to 70s, the Lakewood Amateur Radio Club. They fell silent when he showed his badge. "I'm investigating the White family disappearance," Rodriguez explained. "Robert White was one of you." Gerald Freeman, a bearded 67-year-old with thick glasses, nodded gravely. "Robert became different in those last months, always monitoring these specific frequencies." He pushed a notebook across the table. "Mostly military bands. He claimed he was picking up Soviet transmissions targeting him specifically." Back at the White residence, Rodriguez examined Robert's radio equipment. The engineering precision was evident in the modifications, additional filters, amplifiers, and a custom recording setup that suggested obsessive monitoring. "He built this to capture something specific," Rodriguez muttered, making detailed notes. The investigation's quiet progress was interrupted when FBI Special Agent Thomas Lander strode into the Lakewood Police Department. Tall, 45, with an immaculate dark suit, he presented his credentials with practiced efficiency. "The Bureau is officially taking lead on the White case," Lander announced, setting his briefcase on Rodriguez's desk. Their first meeting in the conference room was tense, the walls covered with photos of the missing family. "With all due respect," Rodriguez argued, "my team has been working this case for months. We know this community." Lander remained unmoved. "This isn't about jurisdiction pride, Detective. Robert White had security clearance at Martin Marietta. This is potentially a national security matter." The following day, Lander interviewed Dave Mathers in the Martin Marietta cafeteria. "Robert mentioned catching strange codes in the weeks before," Mathers recalled, lowering his voice. "I thought it was just nerd talk, but he seemed genuinely scared." A more reserved colleague pulled Lander aside afterward. White was working on communication systems for Reagan's SDI project, the Star Wars initiative. Nothing top secret, but sensitive. While the FBI pursued the national security angle, Margaret Collins transformed her temporary apartment's living room into a makeshift command center. Maps covered one wall, a detailed timeline another, and police reports were stacked in meticulous piles on every surface. "People disappear from headlines much faster than they do from real life," Margaret told the local newspaper editor over the phone, successfully convincing him to run another front-page story on the 3-month anniversary. That evening, the First Baptist Church held a candlelight vigil. Pastor William Donovan led prayers as a slideshow of White family photos played on a projector. Dorothy Evans stood silently beside Margaret, both women's faces illuminated by flickering candles. Later that week, Karen Fisher, the Whites' neighbor, revealed something troubling to Rodriguez during a follow-up interview on her front porch. "I heard arguments coming from their house at night," she admitted reluctantly. Robert seemed increasingly agitated, talking about them watching his family. Pastor Donovan was equally hesitant when Rodriguez questioned him the next day. Robert sought spiritual counseling 3 times that October, he finally admitted. He spoke about dark forces threatening his family. I thought it was figurative language about worldly temptations. At FBI headquarters in Denver, Lander met with military intelligence officials in a secure room. Some of White's projects were classified, a stern-faced colonel explained. We need to know exactly what he might have taken with him. Margaret Collins fell asleep on her couch that night, surrounded by missing persons flyers, a television news report about Lakewood's mysterious vanished family playing in the background. When Rodriguez finally gained access to Robert's personal office at Martin Marietta, he methodically searched through drawers and cabinets. Behind the lining of a bottom drawer, he discovered a folded paper that made his heart race. Unfolding it revealed detailed schematics that initially appeared to be plans for an underground bunker, but as he turned it over, Rodriguez discovered frantic notes scribbled in the margins. The walls aren't thick enough. They can hear us through normal walls. We need more insulation. Rodriguez stared at the bunker schematics, his mind racing with implications. This wasn't just paranoia. It was preparation. What had Robert White been planning? And why? Spring arrived in Colorado, melting the winter snow and revealing the dormant investigation beneath. Inside the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, a tense meeting unfolded as Sheriff Bill Thompson addressed his team. We've got 3 new missing persons cases, a homicide in Golden, and budget cuts coming down from the county, Thompson announced, avoiding eye contact with Rodriguez. The White case moves to secondary investigation status effective immediately. Rodriguez protested, but the decision had already been made. The White family was becoming a cold case, slowly disappearing from priority just as they had vanished from their lives 6 months earlier. 2 weeks later, FBI agent Lander called a press conference that would divide the community. Standing before microphones at the Lakewood Municipal Building, his clinical tone sent shockwaves through the room. In cases of family disappearances without evidence of external force, we frequently encounter situations of intrafamilial abduction, Lander explained to the stunned reporters. We are thoroughly investigating Robert White's background and mental state prior to the incident. Margaret Collins watched the broadcast from her apartment, her face contorting with rage as she hurled her glass at the television screen. How dare they blame Robert when they have no idea what happened? She screamed to the empty room, glass shards glittering on the carpet like the fractured investigation itself. At Martin Marietta's cafeteria the following day, Dave Mathers pounded the table during lunch break, defending his absent colleague to co-workers. Robert was devoted to his family. This theory is absurd, he insisted. The FBI is just covering their asses because they can't solve the case. Yet across town, Karen Fisher shared a different perspective with Detective Rodriguez during a follow-up interview on her front porch. In the weeks before they vanished, I heard intense arguments coming from their house, always late at night, she admitted reluctantly. I never mentioned it before because, well, everyone argues, right? But Robert's voice sounded different, almost desperate. Pastor Donovan finally revealed his own troubling recollections when Rodriguez visited the First Baptist Church that weekend. Robert sought my counsel 3 times that October, the pastor confessed, fidgeting with his coffee cup. He spoke about protecting his family from dark forces. I assumed it was figurative language about worldly temptations, but now I wonder if I missed something crucial. Margaret Collins refused to entertain any narrative that cast suspicion on her son-in-law, though her voice carried less certainty than before. I've known that man for 10 years, she insisted during a community meeting at the church. He's not perfect, but he would never harm Sarah or Michael. In September of 1988, almost a year after the disappearance, the White case was officially reclassified as inactive. Margaret, her face now aged beyond her 59 years, sold her Denver home to finance private investigators. The first of these, Raymond Vasquez, A former Denver police detective with sharp eyes and methodical habits focused immediately on Robert's radio hobby. White had become obsessed with shortwave transmissions in the months before the disappearance, Vasquez discovered after interviewing fellow radio enthusiasts across the region. He talked constantly about intercepting coded messages he believed were of Soviet origin. On the second anniversary of the disappearance, Brian Evans, now 11, started carrying a small notebook everywhere, documenting theories about his missing friend. His mother Dorothy finally made the painful decision to sell their house. "I can't bear looking out the window at that empty house anymore," she explained to the realtor, tears welling in her eyes. At the 5-year mark, journalist Alan Weissman's special feature in the Denver Post revealed a disturbing oversight. Robert White had withdrawn $1,200 in cash 3 days before the disappearance, information somehow missing from the initial police reports. Margaret's frustration transformed into activism. She founded the Colorado Missing Families Network, dedicating her remaining energy to keeping cases like her daughter's from fading into statistical obscurity. In 1993, Detective Lisa Nguyen, newly transferred from Denver Homicide, was assigned to review the White case under Lakewood's new police administration. "Cases like this are puzzles with pieces that fade over time," she explained to Margaret during their first meeting. "My job is to find new angles before the picture is completely lost." After nearly 7 years without answers, the news Margaret both dreaded and secretly hoped for finally arrived. The White House would be sold to Stephen Blackwell, a recently divorced engineer who, unknowingly, was about to trigger the revelation everyone had been searching for all along. Margaret Collins sat in the realtor's office, her trembling hand hovering over the final page of paperwork. The sale of her daughter's house felt like the ultimate surrender, an admission that Sarah might never return. Yet practicality had finally overcome hope after 7 long years. "I need the special inspection clause included," she insisted, pointing to the handwritten addition. "If new evidence emerges, the buyer must permit investigators access to the property." The realtor nodded sympathetically, sliding the papers across the desk for her signature. With each stroke of the pen, Margaret felt as though she were erasing another trace of Sarah's existence. 2 weeks later, Stephen Blackwell stood in the empty living room of his new home, his footsteps echoing against the bare walls. At 38, the recently divorced engineer had purchased the infamous White House at a considerable discount, enough to offset the property's troubled history. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating the space where a family had once lived their ordinary life before vanishing without explanation. "A fresh start," he murmured to himself, running a hand through his beard. He'd known about the house's history. Everyone in Lakewood did, but the substantial price reduction had overridden any superstitious concerns. Before moving in his furniture, Blackwell hired Thomas Reynolds, a structural inspector, to evaluate the property thoroughly. A cautious man by nature, he wanted to ensure the house's notorious past didn't conceal more mundane problems like foundation issues or outdated wiring. On a rainy March afternoon, Reynolds methodically worked his way through the basement with a laser measuring device. The 52-year-old inspector adjusted his metal-framed glasses, frowning as he checked his measurements for the 3rd time. "Mr. Blackwell," he called up the stairs, "could you come down here a moment?" Blackwell descended to find Reynolds studying his clipboard with evident confusion. "Something doesn't add up," Reynolds explained, tapping his pencil against the basement's east wall. "According to these measurements, there should be approximately 2 more meters of space between this wall and the property line. The interior dimensions don't match the exterior." The next morning, Blackwell telephoned Detective Nguyen, explaining the discrepancy. Her response was professional but dismissive. "Old houses often have structural peculiarities, Mr. Blackwell," she explained. "Without more concrete evidence, this is likely inconclusive for the White case." Unsatisfied and increasingly curious, Blackwell contacted Margaret Collins directly. The news of a potential hidden space galvanized the woman who had spent 7 years searching for answers. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. After seeing the measurements herself, Margaret immediately pressured the police department to investigate. When authorities hesitated to damage private property based on imprecise measurements, she turned to the local media, a tactic that had served her well in keeping her daughter's case alive. 7 years I've been asking them to investigate every inch of that house, Margaret told a KMGH reporter on her front lawn, her face drawn but determined. Now we have evidence of a hidden space, and they're still dragging their feet. The public pressure worked. On April 5, 1994, Judge Howard Timmerman issued a warrant authorizing a complete structural inspection of the property. On the eve of the scheduled inspection, reporter Alan Weissman, who had tracked the case for years, made a discovery in the municipal archives that would change everything. Buried in poorly indexed building permits was a document showing that in 1985, 2 years before the disappearance, Robert White had obtained a license for residential structural modifications, but the specific details had never been properly recorded. What exactly did Robert White build in his house? Asked the Denver Post headline on the morning of April 6th, as investigation teams prepared to discover what lurked behind the walls of the house on Maple Street. The morning of April 6th dawned cold in Lakewood. A small crowd gathered on Maple Street, held at bay by yellow police tape while Margaret Collins stood silently beside Detective Nguyen. The elderly woman's completely white hair framed a face marked by 7 years of uncertainty as she watched the forensic team prepare their equipment. We're about to breach the east wall of the basement, where measurements indicate a possible cavity, Lieutenant Garcia explained to the local news cameras. The process would be methodical. First small exploratory holes with endoscopic cameras, then careful removal of material to preserve any potential evidence. At 10:17 in the morning, the forensic technician inserted the first camera through a test hole. His expression changed instantly, professional detachment giving way to shock. "Lieutenant, we need reinforcements immediately," he said with controlled urgency. "There's a defined space behind this wall, and there appears to be evidence of human occupation." The statement triggered controlled frenzy. Paramedics were called as a precaution, while the team carefully accelerated the opening process. When they finally created a sufficient breach, investigators stood frozen at the site. A narrow corridor, illuminated by weak emergency lights powered by nearly depleted batteries, leading to a makeshift room of approximately 12 square meters. And inside, 3 emaciated human figures with long hair and beards, wearing tattered versions of the same clothes documented in the missing persons report 7 years earlier: Robert, Sarah, and Michael White. "My God, they're alive," whispered Detective Nguyen as paramedics quickly advanced through the narrow corridor. The scene inside the small room was disturbing: shelves with empty cans and water containers, an improvised chemical toilet, 3 thin mattresses on the floor, and walls covered with seemingly random notations, numbers, radio frequencies, and references to enemy codes. A modified amateur radio occupied a small table, alongside dozens of notebooks filled with Robert's handwriting. Sarah and Michael, severely malnourished with evident muscle atrophy, responded weakly to stimuli, their eyes unaccustomed to full light. Robert, long gray beard covering his face, appeared catatonic, repeatedly muttering about signals and security protocols. As the 3 were carefully transported to ambulances, Margaret Collins fainted, overwhelmed by a reality that surpassed even her worst nightmares and most hopeful prayers. At St. Anthony Hospital, doctors documented the critical condition of all 3: severe malnutrition, multiple vitamin deficiencies, atrophied musculature, serious dental problems, and physiological adaptations consistent with prolonged confinement in a reduced space. Michael, now 15, weighed only 70 pounds, the average weight of a 9-year-old child. "It's a miracle they survived," declared Dr. Edward Michaels, the hospital's emergency director. "The water supply was almost depleted. A few more days, and we would have had a complete tragedy." By the 3rd day of hospitalization, Sarah had regained enough strength to begin revealing fragments of their terrible experience. Robert was certain, absolutely certain, that we were being hunted, she explained in a hoarse voice to Detective Nguyen. That October night, he woke us in panic, saying he'd intercepted Soviet codes on his radio, that they were coming for us because of his work at Martin Marietta. Sarah described how initially she believed it would be just one night in the safety shelter Robert had secretly built years before. He had supplies for months, always talked about being prepared, but after we entered, he locked the door, said we couldn't leave until receiving the safe signal. Her account was interrupted by crying. At first I screamed, begged, but Michael was frightened by our shouting, so I tried to stay calm, thinking Robert's madness would pass in a few days. Her voice failed, but it never did. While Sarah spoke with authorities, Michael received specialized psychological care. Dr. Fernandez, the pediatric psychiatrist, reported, "The young man has lived more than half his life in confinement. His understanding of the world stopped in 1987. He believes Ronald Reagan is still president and constantly asks about his Nintendo." As nurses tended to Michael's physical needs, one of them made a disturbing discovery while preparing him for a bath. Sewn into the lining of his tattered Rockies shirt was a small map drawn with what appeared to be dried blood, showing a second chamber in the bunker that authorities had not yet discovered. The small map sewn into Michael's shirt sent a ripple of urgency through the investigation team. Nurse Susan Palmer immediately notified Detective Nguyen, who was still processing Sarah's initial statements. "The stitching is crude but deliberate," explained Palmer, carefully handling the tattered Rockies shirt. "It appears to have been sewn using threads pulled from clothing, possibly with a makeshift needle." Within hours, Nguyen assembled a forensic team to return to the Maple Street house. The map, drawn with what lab tests later confirmed was indeed dried blood, indicated a hidden panel in the northern wall of the main bunker, a second chamber that had been overlooked during the initial rescue. The following morning, technicians carefully removed the false panel, revealing a space even smaller than the main bunker, crammed with rudimentary electronic equipment and stacks of journals reaching to the ceiling. The room reeked of electrical components and human desperation. "This was Robert's command center," Nguyen observed, carefully photographing each item before removal. One device particularly stood out, a contraption assembled from radio parts and clock components, labeled in Robert's handwriting as Enemy Surveillance Field Detector. Dr. Philip Davidson, a 55-year-old forensic psychiatrist brought in to analyze the psychological aspects of the case, examined Robert's journals chronologically, starting with entries from 1984. The initial entries appear rational, focused on genuine civil defense concerns, Davidson noted, showing Nguyen the neat handwriting and organized thoughts of early pages. But observe how the handwriting and content become progressively more erratic over time, classic documentation of a psychotic break unfolding. At St. Anthony Hospital, Sarah's physical rehabilitation progressed painfully. Physical therapists worked to rebuild muscle that had atrophied during 7 years of confinement, each session a battle against a body that had adapted to minimal movement in restricted space. "Try again, Mrs. White," encouraged the therapist, as Sarah gripped the parallel bars, tears streaming down her face while taking tentative steps. "Your body remembers how to do this." Michael's recovery faced different challenges. In occupational therapy, the teenager's skeletal hands struggled with basic tasks, like holding a pen or buttoning a shirt. Fine motor skills that had deteriorated in the bunker, where survival required little dexterity. "It's like my fingers don't listen to my brain," Michael explained, frustration evident as he repeatedly dropped a simple puzzle piece. During psychological evaluations, Sarah's statements about Robert confused the clinical team. "He really believed he was protecting us," she insisted during one session, her voice surprisingly defensive. "You don't understand what it's like to love someone who's losing touch with reality." Michael's interaction with modern technology revealed the extent of his temporal displacement. When a nurse used a cell phone near his bed, he stared in bewilderment. "Where's the cord?" he asked repeatedly. How does it connect to the wall? Margaret Collins observed these interactions from a distance, her heart breaking anew with each revelation. How much of them actually survived those years? She whispered to Dr. Goldstein, the lead psychologist overseeing the family's mental health treatment. In the psychiatric ward, Robert White stared at his reflection in the polished metal mirror of his secure room. Now properly medicated, moments of lucidity broke through his psychosis, bringing with them the horrifying realization of what he had done. His trembling fingers touched his long beard as recognition dawned in his eyes. Prosecutors Carol Vasquez and Richard Thompson met with the district attorney in his office, the atmosphere tense as they debated charges. We must balance justice for the victims with the obvious mental illness component, Vasquez argued, spreading medical reports across the desk. Outside the hospital, journalists clustered near the entrance, while Dr. Michaels delivered a statement about the Whites' physical condition. We're treating medical conditions rarely seen outside war zones or prisoner camps, he explained grimly, refusing to take questions afterward. From her hospital window, Sarah silently observed the world of 1994. Different cars, different clothing styles, a woman talking on a cell phone, a world that had continued without her for 7 years. After her therapy session that evening, Sarah asked to speak privately with Detective Nguyen, and when they were finally alone, revealed with a trembling voice, "There were moments when we could have escaped, moments when Robert lost consciousness during his episodes. But I need you to understand why I chose to stay when I could have saved Michael much earlier." "There were moments we could have escaped," Sarah whispered, her thin fingers twisting the edge of her hospital blanket. 3 months after we entered the bunker, Robert had a complete breakdown. He lost consciousness for almost 24 hours. Detective Nguyen leaned forward, recorder running quietly between them. Sarah's eyes focused on some distant point as she described that first winter underground. "I fashioned tools from metal can lids, working for hours while Robert lay unconscious," Sarah continued. "I nearly had the lock mechanism disengaged when he suddenly woke." Her voice faltered. "He wasn't himself. He wasn't the Robert I married." Sarah pulled aside her hospital gown collar, revealing a jagged scar across her collarbone. "After that night, I understood our survival depended on playing by his rules." Nguyen studied the old wound. "You never tried again?" "I couldn't risk Michael's safety," Sarah explained. "Robert installed additional locks after that attempt, and his episodes became more unpredictable. I focused instead on keeping Michael's mind alive." Across the hospital, Michael sat with Dr. Goldstein in the therapy room, meticulously arranging wooden blocks to recreate the bunker's layout. "Mom turned the east wall into our calendar and blackboard," he explained, placing tiny paper figures representing his family. "She taught me math using marks on the wall, said it was our secret code." While the Whites struggled with their recovery, Elizabeth Mercer, Robert's 36-year-old public defender, gathered psychiatric experts in her cluttered office. "We need to establish a clear history of mental deterioration before the incident," she instructed, spreading medical records across the table. "The prosecution will focus on premeditation, the bunker construction, supply purchases. We need to demonstrate diminished capacity." Across town, prosecutor Carol Vasquez examined building material receipts from 1985, highlighting suspicious items. "Industrial acoustic insulation isn't typical residential renovation material," she noted to her investigator. "He was methodically planning this for years before the breakdown." In her modest apartment, Margaret Collins organized a bedroom for Michael's eventual release, placing a modern Nintendo system beside preserved childhood toys. Her face reflected the impossible balance between past and present, between the 8-year-old grandson she lost and the 15-year-old stranger returning to her. At the rehabilitation center, education specialists evaluated Michael, expecting significant developmental delays. They were stunned when he easily solved advanced mathematics problems. "Mom taught me algebra when we finished the arithmetic books," he explained matter-of-factly. "We did calculus problems in the dust when paper ran out." Sarah continued her physical therapy, her atrophied muscles slowly regaining strength. During aquatic therapy, she watched children playing freely in the hospital courtyard through the window, her expression unreadable. In his psychiatric cell, Robert wrote a shaky letter. "Sarah, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve forgiveness. But you must know that in my distorted world, I was convinced I was protecting you both." The following week, Margaret visited Robert at the psychiatric facility. They sat separated by an acrylic divider, studying each other in silence before Margaret finally spoke. "You stole 7 years that can never be recovered," she said quietly, her voice neither accusatory nor forgiving, simply stating an irrefutable fact. Michael experienced ice cream for the first time in 7 years during a supervised outing. The flavor explosion triggered an emotional response so intense that tears streamed down his face while he continued eating, unwilling to stop despite the overwhelming sensations. Dr. Goldstein showed Sarah the improvised notebooks recovered from the bunker, where Michael had written elaborate stories about superheroes rescuing trapped people. He was processing his trauma the only way he could, the psychologist explained gently. Later that evening, Sarah read Robert's journals recovered from the secret compartment, discovering the progression of his mental illness and the agonizing moments of lucidity where he questioned his own actions. A tense meeting between prosecutors, defense attorneys, and medical experts concluded the day, debating whether Robert posed a continuing danger. "He built that prison once," Prosecutor Thompson argued. "What prevents him from doing it again if released?" On the eve of the first court hearing, Sarah requested a private moment with the prosecutors, and to the shock of her own mother and the attorneys, firmly declared, "I don't want Robert to spend the rest of his life in prison. He needs treatment, not punishment, and I will testify for the defense if you seek maximum penalties." Margaret Collins stared at her daughter in disbelief, the words hanging in the air between them like a physical barrier. They stood in Sarah's hospital room, morning light streaming through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the institutional linoleum. "How can you defend the man who stole 7 years of your life and nearly killed my grandson?" Margaret's voice rose, her hands trembling with emotion. Sarah's face hardened, a determination visible that hadn't been there during her early recovery. "You weren't there. You didn't see the disease consuming him day by day." Their argument continued, nurses glancing nervously through the doorway as voices escalated. The division between them grew. A mother who had spent 7 years searching, unable to comprehend mercy for the person responsible. A daughter who had lived through a nightmare and emerged with a complex understanding of her captor. Later that afternoon, Prosecutor Vasquez spread evidence from the bunker across a conference table where Sarah sat with her physical therapist nearby for support. "This calendar," Vasquez explained, pointing to a meticulously marked chart recovered from the bunker, shows where Robert tracked what he called clarity days versus danger days. It suggests periods of lucidity where he understood what he was doing. Sarah studied the familiar markings, her expression unreadable. His lucid moments were the most painful. He would recognize what was happening, promise to get us out, then slide back into delusion within hours. Outside the courthouse the following day, protesters from the Justice for Victims group gathered with signs displaying before and after photos of Michael. "This isn't love, it's abuse," their placards declared as news cameras captured their vigil. In his therapy session that morning, Michael worked with colored pencils, drawing his family portrait. Dr. Goldstein observed silently as the teenager created a divided image of Robert, half-smiling father, half-monstrous figure, revealing his conflicted perception of the man who had both raised and imprisoned him. "I remember when he taught me to throw a baseball," Michael said quietly, shading the normal side of his father's face. "But I also remember when he wouldn't let us use the flashlight because he thought satellites would detect the battery energy." Sarah met with Dr. Eleanor Hughes, a psychiatrist specializing in family trauma, seeking clarity on her own conflicted feelings. "I lived with 2 Roberts," she explained, "the man I loved and the man consumed by illness who imprisoned us." In his chambers, Judge Hammond sat surrounded by law books, shaking his head at his clerk. There are no clear precedents for a case where the line between perpetrator and victim of one's own disease is so thin, he admitted, reviewing the psychiatric evaluations. Robert White spent those days in his psychiatric cell, watching children playing in a nearby schoolyard through his small barred window. Silent tears traced paths through his now trimmed beard as he confronted the reality of what he had done to his own family. On a quiet afternoon, Michael visited his former home on Maple Street with Dr. Davidson, watching from the sidewalk as construction workers permanently sealed the bunker entrance. His expression revealed both relief and strange sorrow, the complex emotions of seeing a prison that had also been his only concept of home for nearly half his life. The courthouse fell silent when Robert entered for his first formal hearing, thin and aged beyond his years in standard-issue orange coveralls. His eyes met Sarah's across the room, and both collapsed into tears simultaneously, a wordless exchange containing 7 years of shared suffering impossible for others to comprehend. Margaret refused to enter the courtroom, instead waiting in the hallway clutching photographs of Sarah and Michael from before the disappearance, studying their smiling faces as if searching for something irretrievably lost. Defense psychiatrists presented brain scans of Robert, pointing to abnormalities. These areas show patterns consistent with severe untreated paranoid schizophrenia, the expert testified, as Robert stared at his own brain images with detached curiosity. The legal proceedings were suddenly interrupted when, in the early morning hours, a security officer discovered Robert unconscious in his cell, blood pooling beneath his slashed wrists. The suicide note, later delivered to Detective Nguyen, read simply, "I now see clearly what I've done. I cannot live with it." When Michael discovered his father's suicide attempt, he made a surprising request that left everyone perplexed. "I want to see him. I want to talk to my father, alone, before they decide what happens to him." Michael's request to see his father hung in the air like a physical presence, leaving doctors and authorities equally stunned. After heated debates among the medical team, Dr. Davidson finally agreed to supervise the meeting, believing it might provide therapeutic value for the teenager still struggling to process his trauma. 3 days later, Michael was escorted down the sterile corridor of the psychiatric hospital, his thin frame moving with determined purpose despite his physical weakness. Dr. Davidson walked beside him, occasionally glancing at the boy's face for signs of distress. "Are you certain about this, Michael?" the doctor asked gently as they approached the secure visitation room. Michael nodded, clutching a small object in his hand, the Nintendo controller Brian had preserved for 7 years. "I need answers only he can give me." Inside the room, Robert sat waiting, his wrists bandaged from his suicide attempt, tears forming immediately upon seeing his son. The transformation was striking. Medication had cleared the wild paranoia from his eyes, leaving behind a broken man fully aware of what he had done. Michael sat across from his father, placing the Nintendo controller on the table between them. "Remember when you taught me to play?" he asked quietly. "Before everything changed?" Robert's hands trembled as he stared at the controller. "World 1-1, he whispered. "You couldn't get past the first Goomba." "When did you decide we had to stay down there forever?" Michael asked directly, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. The heart monitor attached to Robert began beeping faster. "There were voices," Robert explained, his voice breaking, "and codes on the radio, as real to me as you are sitting here now. I truly believed I was saving you both." Michael studied his father's face, searching for something only he could recognize. "Mom said you were sick, not evil. It took me a long time to understand the difference." Across town, Sarah sat in a conference room at the hospital, a recorder running as she dictated her complete testimony to Dr. Hughes and Detective Nguyen. "I began counting days by marking the wall but stopped after the first year. Time became our enemy." Her voice strengthened as she described the educational system she created for Michael. "I turned food packaging into flashcards. I recited books from memory to keep him connected to stories. When the pencils ran out, We used charcoal from the emergency supplies. Meanwhile, prosecutors and defense attorneys engaged in intense negotiations about a possible plea agreement. 20 years in maximum security psychiatric treatment, with annual reviews of his condition, proposed Mercer, sliding the document across the table. That evening, Margaret and Sarah sat together in the hospital garden, a tentative reconciliation forming between them. "You've punished him more than any court ever could, haven't you?" Margaret asked quietly. "You lived with the result of his illness every day." Sarah nodded, tears falling silently. "There were moments I hated him with every fiber of my being, and moments when I saw glimpses of the man I married fighting to surface through the madness." In his therapy session the following day, Michael worked with Dr. Goldstein, creating a timeline of his life in the bunker, marking significant moments. "This was when Mom pretended it was my 10th birthday. We made a cake from the last cookies. 2 weeks later, Sarah took her first steps without a cane, the physical therapist hovering nearby. Through the window, she watched Michael sitting in the hospital garden, sunlight touching his face after years of artificial illumination. In the final court hearing, Robert listened as Judge Hammond delivered his sentence. "Mr. White, your untreated illness caused incalculable harm. But this court recognizes that the man before us is not the same who committed these acts." By early summer, Sarah and Michael visited a small house in Portland, Oregon, far from the memories and notoriety of Lakewood. "We need a new beginning, near the ocean," Sarah explained to the real estate agent as Michael explored the backyard. Before their departure, Brian and Michael shared a private moment of farewell, Brian presenting a box containing all the newspaper clippings and clues he had collected during the years of searching. "I never stopped looking for you, not for a single day." On the eve of their move to Portland, Sarah returned alone to the house on Maple Street one last time, and as she stood silently in the sealed basement, she noticed something all investigators had missed, an almost imperceptible rhythmic sound coming from inside the wall that had not been completely explored, like the ticking of a clock that never stopped. Sarah froze, her breath catching as the faint rhythmic sound continued from within the wall. After 7 years in confinement, she recognized instantly what ordinary ears might miss: a mechanical ticking, deliberate and precise. Without hesitation, she rushed from the basement and called Detective Nguyen from her car. Within hours, Nguyen arrived with a small technical team using ultra-sensitive listening equipment to pinpoint the sound's origin. "It's definitely mechanical," confirmed the technician, placing markers on the section of wall that remained unexplored. Regular intervals, like clockwork. The following morning, technicians carefully removed the final section of wall, revealing a small sealed chamber containing an elaborate mechanical metronome. The device, ingeniously designed with weights and counterweights, had been constructed to function autonomously for a decade. A handwritten label in Robert's precise engineering script read, "Safety timer. When it stops, the world will be safe again." 10 years, Sarah whispered, understanding the terrible logic of her husband's delusion. "He believed we needed to hide for exactly 10 years. Nguyen studied the device with solemn respect. He built a countdown to salvation that never existed. This final discovery brought genuine closure for Sarah. As the device was carefully removed for evidence, she touched the wall one last time. "Now we can truly leave," she said simply. 3 weeks later, Sarah and Michael settled into their new home in Portland. The salty Pacific air, a constant reminder of their distance from landlocked Colorado. Their modest house near the ocean became a sanctuary for healing, its windows deliberately large and numerous, Sarah's insistence on light and openness after years of darkness. In the kitchen of their new home, Sarah began writing what would become her memoir, Surviving the Bunker: A Mother, a Son, and 7 Years of Darkness. Sunlight streamed through the windows as her pen moved across the page, transforming trauma into testimony. Meanwhile, Michael faced his first day in an adapted educational program, nervously clutching advanced mathematics textbooks while struggling with basic cultural references his peers took for granted. His therapist had prepared teachers for his unique situation, intellectually advanced in certain subjects, while profoundly isolated from normal teenage development. 10 years later, in spring of 2004, Michael White stood tall in his graduation cap and gown, receiving his psychology degree with honors from the University of Oregon. From the audience, Sarah and Margaret applauded tearfully, witnessing the culmination of an extraordinary journey of resilience. That same year, Sarah became a sought-after speaker on trauma and survival. "I transformed our hell into an improvised school," she often explained to audiences, because education was the only freedom I could offer in those circumstances. Robert remained at the Pueblo State Psychiatric Institution, where proper medication gradually restored his ability to recognize reality. In carefully supervised therapy sessions, he helped other patients identify symptoms of psychotic relapse, his own experience serving as both warning and source of insight. Margaret Collins dedicated her retirement years to the Colorado Missing Families Network, guiding families of missing persons through the labyrinth of emotional and bureaucratic challenges she had navigated alone. Her office walls displayed photographs of both resolved and pending cases, visual testimony to her unwavering commitment. The house on Maple Street was eventually demolished, the community establishing a small memorial park with a simple bench and discreet plaque reading, "In honor of human resilience in the face of the unthinkable." On the 10th anniversary of their rescue, Michael returned to Lakewood, now a confident young man of 25. Walking alone through the memorial park at dusk, he removed 3 objects from his backpack: his faded Rockies shirt, now far too small, one of the improvised notebooks where his mother had recorded his school reports during captivity, and a key, the key to the bunker that was once his prison, now a symbol of doors that would never close again.